Today we're here to talk about Integration Hub and data streams. So just a high-level agenda here. So what are data streams and why should you use them? The components of a data stream, and then what everyone wants to see is the demo of it in practice. That's the interesting part. All right, so why should you use them? So as we'll see in a minute, it packages integrations into a nice container. There's a number of features in this that are probably not going to be used a lot, but it puts it all into one place so you can have it well organized. It supports paging and large responses. That's really the paging, I would say, is the primary reason you would use data streams. If you're not using paging, it's probably a little bit of overkill. It's an action and flow designer. You get kind of like all the built-in logging and error handling that you would get with any of the other flow components. So that's all kind of built in for you. How do you get it? So it's in Integration Hub Enterprise Pack. So one of the kind of the highest level there. You can activate this on a PBI if you go into the developer site and activate those additional plugins. So you must have that, otherwise you're not gonna see it. All right, how do you get to it? So you're basically gonna open Flow Designer. You're going to click the new button in the top right corner, as I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with. And then you'll have this new option of data stream. So you'll click that and we'll look at the components of the data stream. So basically from the creation and kind of how it templatizes this special kind of action. So you're going to get, once you hit create a new action, you're going to get your standard action properties screen here. So your name, your application, if you're developing in a particular scope, and then where it's accessible from. So this is not special to data stream actions. This is special though. When you create a data stream action, you get this outline of things, and we'll talk through each of these because there's also options within each, but it breaks it into these different sections. So you have inputs, which is a standard thing with actions and flows in general. Action pre-processing, where you can perform certain actions before you make any requests at all. The request, which we'll look at, this is where your actual request to your system is happening. Then your parsing of your response, and then your outputs. We'll talk through each of these in more detail. The first one, actions, not a whole lot special. For the sake of the demo, I created an input called table. This is just going to take a table name, and that'll allow you, when you get to actually configuring the import, that you can say, oh, I want it to be this table. The pre-processing is this, as it says here in the help, it's going to be executed only once per action. So there's probably not a lot of cases where you have to use this, where you have to necessarily do something before you're making any kind of call. But I can give one real world example where I had to use this. So one of the integrations I was doing was with a system that was not using OAuth, not using basic auth. It was using an API key, but the API key was actually a session token that expired like every 2 hours. So at the beginning of the process here, I used this to check on whether or not the token was valid, and then if not, refresh it. So that was something that made sense to do at the beginning of the call. There's also another spot this can be done, but that's one kind of real world example where if you're dealing with kind of a unique authentication condition, you could put that in the action pre-processing. So the next is your request setup here. So if you look on the request action here, you have a few options here. So you have enable pagination, which we're gonna talk about. That's one of the main reasons you're going to use a data stream. And then run a script before each request. This is a lot like your action pre-processing that we just talked about, except in this case that would happen before every request. So again, with the authentication example, it might, if your time for the request processing takes a long time, or you're concerned about crossing some kind of race condition where your token expires, maybe you want to check that before every single request you make. So this is another spot where you could run that pre-processing, much like on each request instead of at the beginning. So again, probably not something that's going to get used a lot, but it is a nice option to have. This is where things get interesting with the paginations. There's a few really important concepts here. So the first one is there's this out-of-box initial pagination variable that is used to communicate whether or not there are additional pages to be processed. So it's called get next page. It sets a false, and it's going to get it from the script. You always have to set it to true if you want it to process additional pages. If you just leave this, it's going to hit that first page and then say, oh, my value is false. So basically how you do that is you're going to do some calculation in your script here. In this case, use the table API out of ServiceNow. What we're doing here is we're grabbing from the header what the total count of items is, and if the offset is not equal to the total count, it's going to set the offset to the next one and then set the get next page to true. So this is going to, on every call, it's going to look at the data, and then you have to tell it whether or not you're going to process the next page. And then usually whatever system you're requesting to, you're going to have to say, okay, get me this offset, or get me this next, skip this number of records. It's really going to depend on the API that you're going against. What you'll want to look at too is the page response for what data comes back. It's usually going to return the headers and some other data. So this is an example of what it looks like from the table API. So the response headers is going to return, the server, these different header values, and the one that I used in this case was the total count. So against the table API, for instance, I have 67 records, so I know that I need to set up my paging to be able to handle that. What I did for the sake of this demo and to prove this out is that it's only going to return one record at a time. So this should go through 67 pages basically of records, a record length of one. There are other advanced pagination options here. There were some challenges I found with this, where what you can do is you can say, okay, I want to look I want to set a pagination variable based on the response body, and you can extract that value. You can either use JSON or XML here, depending on what your system is returning. But this uses JSON path, and in this case, we're saying the response body from ServiceNow returns an array of result. I'm getting the 10th one and a number, and this is just an example. So one of the things I was not able to find that I'm still looking for is what capabilities JSON path and what implementation ServiceNow is using. There's a link in this here to a SmartBear page that has what the syntax for JSON path is. Some implementations of it allow you to say, get a count of records. So you can say, I think in the JSON case, it's, you could say like result dot length or size. I forget which one it is, but in the implementation that ServiceNow is using, it doesn't appear to support that. So it can get a little tricky about if you're dealing with it from the response body, about how to get that if there are additional records available. But this is one of the ways to do it. The preferred way would be to get it, and the way that it seems to handle the best is getting it from the page response and the headers. Hopefully there's a header value in there that you can use. The other, we kind of talked about this a bit, where this is the other kind of script step you can use before each call. Again, you could use this for potentially authentication, and then you get into your REST step here. So this is very similar to what you would use, in a flow typically. And we'll look at how the parameters are set here in the actual demo. Parsing, this is another thing you have to set up. Really, you don't get a whole lot of options here. It's pretty much going to be your JSON/XML splitter, and then you're gonna parse it with a script here. And what that looks like in the splitter step is like this. So in my case here, we were dealing with JSON. The item path, this is another kind of JSON query thing. You're going to tell it basically what's the array of items I'm going to look at. So in the case of ServiceNow, it's going to be result, and this is the syntax you use to tell it like this is where to look for my array. The script parser this is where you actually go through the rows that you get back and you pull out the data. So you have to configure this and the outputs together. I'll show you what the outputs look like. This is where it's a little bit of one of those ServiceNow magic things where you're like, okay, where does like target object come from, and how does that connect to my output? And I'll explain how that looks, because it can be a little confusing. At least it was to me. So we're going to parse that source item, and then for each value you want to pull out from your response, you're gonna set that to an output variable. So in this case, we have outputs, our target object, which I'll show you where that maps to, and then the actual property. So number is going to be your item and your number, or, in this case, we also have short description, which is item short description. So this is where you're going to map those items. When you first open this script parser step, you'll be able to see like examples for JSON and XML that ServiceNow has provided. Next, so this is the outputs. This is where you actually have to set this up before the script parser will actually work. You technically can set them up separately, but this is a requirement for it to actually work. So you basically set up an object at the top. It doesn't matter what it's called, which is the part that's a little confusing. So you can call this whatever you want as long as it's an object, and that's what target object is going to be. And then under that, you would create each of your properties. So in this case, I just have a couple of strings, number and short description. One of the things to keep in mind too is that you may need to set the max length, as I'm sure a lot of people have experienced, right? If you let it set the default lengths of things, like with strings, it'll be 40 characters, right? A short description, is 100 characters, right? So it's gonna chop off those values. So you're gonna want to, for those longer string fields, you're gonna want to come in here and configure the max length. Those are all the steps to actually set it up. And then how to use it. One of the primary ways to use it is to set up a data source. So I've highlighted some of the important attributes here, but basically you're going to name it, you're going to give it import set, label and table. And then the important parts are you're going to have this option here that says data stream type, integration hub, and then your data stream action. One thing that of note is that it won't show up until you publish that action. So you got to make sure you publish it. And then you can see here under our data stream action inputs, it shows that our input that we said was required a table is here, and I have it set to incident. Just like any import, you can use transforms or the robust transformer to map that data into a system. In this case, I just have my source table of the demo action and then my target table of a ticket list. This is the demo action I created. So we'll kind of look through each of these, and then we'll do a run to see what it looks like. So we have our input here, which we won't go too much into. It's just our table. Our script step, our pre-processing, which I left empty. You can just turn it off, it won't even show up. Then our request. So again, you have these different options. I have the before turned off, and then the pagination. And then in the case of ServiceNow, this was on the screenshot as well. We're using the response header here, adding 1 to the record, since I told it to give me a page size of 1 to prove this out. The rest step here, you're usually not going to obviously do this against the instance itself, but rather a external instance. But for the purposes of this, it's just using a connection alias that's pointing back to the instance itself with a base URL of the table. We can see here that our resource path is going to be the table. I have a limit of 1. And then here it's getting the offset from the output of that pagination. I added an additional transformation here of 2 fixed. One of the things I found was that even though I told it to be an integer, it was adding decimal points of 0.0 to it, which the offset won't work if you have it not an actual integer. But yeah, it's just coming from our pagination step here. You don't actually have to do anything with the get next page variable. You just have to set it, and then it knows, okay, I have to keep executing this until you tell me there's no more records. Our splitter step, so our parsing here, right? There's really just these options available for me. So in the splitter, you're just gonna pick your source format and then your item path, which was that JSON path syntax. And then in the ServiceNow case, it's gonna just return a result array. And then in our script parser step, we have this, these examples, which you can take out their comments, but essentially, like we just looked at, you're gonna parse that input. This is a kind of a little bit of magic where it's there. You have your input source item that's there, and then your outputs target object is where you're going to set your various properties. If you're used to dealing with outputs and flow designer, it's a little weird to not like have to, pick a value and map it in here. It's coming from this script parser step where you're mapping to number and short description. So you just have to make sure that you have those outputs there. And then again, that top action output object, the name doesn't really matter. It can be whatever you want. It's going to use the target object to demonstrate where you see that advanced option. So if you click over here, this is where you can set the length. All right, so let's run a test and kind of see what this logs out for us. It's going through and processing each of those pages. That's why it kind of took a while, right? Because it's looping through instead of grabbing all the records. One of the things when you do a test, it's only going to pull 20 pages. So that's just something to keep in mind. When you run it from the data source, it will obviously pull all the records. But you can see here that it mapped my output items. I mean, it's a little funny that it's output space items, but that does this out of box. But you see each of the items that pull back, my number and my short description. There's a lot of details about how the different variables are being set, what the offset is at that particular point, what your response body looks like. So it does a fair amount of logging, which is configurable, obviously, but when you're developing, it's really good to see, okay, what setting for the pagination and what kind of data am I getting back? Is it mapping correctly? So there's a fair amount of data there. So onto the data source. So I already have this configured. One thing to note here is that just like if you're doing like an Excel import or something like that, you just have to set up the table name, and it will actually create on your import set table, it'll create the fields for you. So you don't have to go through and set up that import set table. You just go and load it, and it'll have the fields there for you. So if I load the records here, and obviously you can schedule, like you would schedule this to run right as a scheduled import, but it loaded these records in, and then you can run your transform as usual, and right. So it pulled in these values from that data source. And if you go back and you look at the executions, you should be able to see that, this one ran. So it got all 67, right? And you can see the proof of that here. That's essentially how this works. There were a couple of things I found, and we're talking to other people, to keep in mind. So the paging can be a little limited and complicated. My experience was that if the system wasn't returning, the source system wasn't returning a header with like, what page am I on, like how many records are left, it can get a little complicated to have to look at the response bodies to get the data, especially with it's seeming that the version of JSON path that's provided doesn't have all the functionality. One of the other things that I definitely ran into, and I know that with helping out a couple other people that this has come up, like if you get a weird error, make sure you're actually getting data back, because it like, especially from the data source, it won't say, oh, you got no data. It throws like some errors that don't necessarily make sense. So what you really want to do is if you run into a error on your data source import, go look at the execution history for the action and make sure you're getting data back and that it's actually working correctly. a couple of resources here. There's a data streaming actions and pagination doc site, which has some pretty good information. It is a little light on the pagination end of things, so that's really the most complicated part of this. And then Chuck did a really good video about the data stream actions as well. So I would definitely check that out for more information. But that's the end of it. What questions, if any, do people have?
For those data streams, do they utilize the retry policies? And if so, I'm just curious how that would work when you're paginating.
I haven't configured one of those yet, but you can, just like a regular, just like a
Okay.
you have a retry policy here, so you can use the default one or define your own. But yes.
Yeah, that's cool. I would just be curious, if it's paginating through 20 pages of data and then on page 10, it's like, oh, there's an error.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if it retries that same page or if it just goes through, if it just stops or something. I'm not just curious about that. But
it's not going to start from the beginning. It should start from whichever step it was on.
okay.
Since it's in this kind of like request section. So this is like it's looping through in this case. So it should just be that particular one. But yeah, definitely a real world thing, right? Like before the existence of this, definitely written integrations with paging. You're like, okay, like now I have to handle like what if it fails on this particular request, right?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And then really just for me, when I'm writing integrations and stuff in Flow, I always have a hard time trying to figure out the best way to approach error handling. Whether that's, if you encounter an error, do you create an incident? Do you notify someone? Like, I'm just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious what other people think, but generally, I like to create an incident because
Okay.
the question always is like, okay, like, does it get assigned to the ServiceNow team? Does it get assigned to the person who is supporting integration? So it's really going to depend on a situation and customer by customer basis, I would say.
And that's a ServiceNow best practice to create an incident off an error of an integration. Just be careful of all your deduplication. Like if you get thousands of errors, you don't want to create thousands of incidents. So you want to make sure you mitigate that. But otherwise, yeah, it's definitely a best practice.